trust relationships. Alright, I don't have a specific whiteboard to introduce this particular nugget because this would be the only one, and I'm going to tick those off as we go anyway. But suffice to say that we're going to be talking about trusts in this particular nugget so that we can better the access that we have from one domain to another. Well, if you've listened to any of my videos from other series, you know that I'm pretty much an avid photographer. That's one of the things that I just love to do. And as a result of that, I also have kind of a unique ambition in that I will very often try to get into places that I'm not necessarily supposed to be so that I can get good photographic opportunities, whether they're various types of public events or concerts or all different kinds of things. And I don't want to be very specific right now because I don't want to get myself in any trouble. However, I've been very successful in getting into places that I wouldn't otherwise be able to get into. And much of it just relates to acting like you know what you're doing and having a level of confidence, and sometimes just talking to people honestly, not trying to sneak around, but just honestly asking for certain kinds of permission. And once I get the permission from somebody, they just seem to let me in sometimes. So it's kind of cool. Well, we have that same kind of thing here in trusts in our Active Directory domains. But you see, we can't just allow people in just for asking. I mean, everybody wants into your network. Hackers, people from other companies, competitors, everybody wants in. So we have to determine what level of trust that we want to have, if any, and if we do decide to grant some type of trust, how we're going to do it and what scope we're going to allow. Now, there are several different types of trust here. The first two are really almost directly related. And what we're going to do in this particular nugget is we're going to discuss these different types of trust and some of the ins and outs of them. And the first one that we'll be discussing here is something called a manual trust. And then before I get into too much detail on how to actually create the trusts, I want to point out some differences in the verbiage. In previous operating systems, we used to either say that we had a trusted domain or a trusting domain. And now Microsoft likes to use the terms outgoing and incoming. In NT4 days, what we would say is, if I had some resources here, maybe I'm a domain admin up here in this domain, and I want people to be able to print to my printer and access my files that have accounts in a different domain. Well, I need to trust the users and groups and computers or whatever it is that are on this domain. So therefore they become my trusted domain down here. That's into the old verbiage, trusted. And then this user, for example, would be able to access my files up here. Another way of looking at that would be if you're a domain admin down here and you're accessing resources using your user accounts, but accessing the resources up here, then this domain would become the trusting domain because they are trusting my users. And the trusted and the trusting kind of got convoluted, and you have to stop and pause and think for a minute as to which context you're in, whether you're in this domain or whether you're in this domain. So Microsoft changed the verbiage now to say instead of saying you're a trusted domain, they just changed it to say that there is an outgoing trust. So it's going out from my domain to these people down here. I'm not really sure that clarifies things much at all, but Microsoft is at least trying to clarify that. So likewise, this domain here, maybe it wants to grant access to this printer and this file share to these users. So they in turn would also create a trust, an outgoing trust, in older operating systems known as a trusted domain. And we would say, now we want to allow this user or these groups or whatever to access resources to, our files or something like that over here. And then these are all one-way trusts that are going on right now. We could also do it as a two-way trust. Now, Microsoft calls this a bidirectional trust, and it kind of implies as if it's a single trust that's created in both directions. That's not really possible. What happens when you create a bidirectional trust is you just simply create both sides of the trust at the same time. So I'm trusting your users, and you are trusting my users, so we have both the outgoing and the incoming trust being created in the same wizard that we will be working with here shortly. And that's what I'm going to demonstrate to you is an external manually created trust that creates this relationship right here, just so that we can kind of kill two birds with one stone. Now, as an example, let's take a look at this diagram right here. Here I have two separate forests. I'll just call this one, Forest 1, for example, and this one, Forest 2. Two totally separate companies of NuggetLab.com and AccuSource.local. They have no business relationship whatsoever in the past, but maybe now they've got some kind of a partnership going on. Maybe one's the parts distributor for another one that's a manufacturer. And so anyway, they need to start exchanging resources and establish a level of trust. Now, if we decide to completely trust one another so that any of these domains over here can access resources in any of these domains over here and vice versa, we could just set up a complete forest trust, which perhaps we can address a little bit later on. However, maybe we don't want to be quite that broad. Maybe we just have some resources in this domain that users in this domain want to access. We don't want to spread it out to all these other child domains. Just these two domains, that's it. So what I could do with this then is to create that trust relationship. As a manual trust, this would be one that I just have to kind of next finish my way through, so it's a manually created, and that's just to contrast it with an automatic transitive trust that we see in the normal flow of trust that we have in each forest. In other words, I didn't have to set up this trust or this trust within this forest. It was set up automatically. But the manual trust would be like an external trust where I have to trust another company. So let's go ahead and do that. Let me show you how I might be able to make that work out. Here let's just go to Active Directory Domains and Trusts, as you might have guessed. And as we open this up, we'll see that we have a domain here, and it already has a single child domain that it's already going to trust. That's the automatic transitive trust that occurs as a result of installing additional domains in a forest. So if I choose the properties for nuggetlab.com, for example, we see that it already trusts west.nuggetlab.com. However, I want to go ahead and add a new trust to trust accusource.local, and as I get past the introduction here, I can just enter in the name of accusource.local. Now, before I type that name, I have to quickly tangent on this to point something out that could cause you a big red X if you don't get ready for this in advance, and that is I have to have a way of resolving accusource.local. Because you see, if we've never done business before, and accusource.local, of course, is not even resolvable on the internet because .local is not available on internet DNS servers, then I have to be able to resolve that name. That could take place through either some kind of forwarding, like conditional forwarding, or stub zones, or something like that. But as long as we're network connected, then we can do it. Now, in Server Manager, you'll see here, and we'll talk about DNS in a different nugget in this series, you'll see that I've got a conditional forward for the wrong domain. I guess better add another conditional forward. I'll add a new conditional forward here for accusource.local. And then I'm going to add in the IP address of the DNS server for accusource.local, and it confirms that it's a valid address and everything, and then we'll just click OK. So now once I've done that, I'll be able to go back over here to Active Directory Domains and Trusts. Let me go back to my properties. I think if I Alt-Tab here, I can get to it. And now, accusource.local. Okay. Then as I click on Next, I specify what kind of trust I want it to be. This is an external trust, which is just going to be a non-transitive trust between a domain and another domain outside of the forest, which is exactly what my objective was when I talked about earlier. I just want my trust to be between this domain here and this domain here, and I don't want it to be transitive so that it also spreads through all the other children there. Okay, so we'll just go ahead and do it that way as an external trust. If I had chosen a forest trust, which we'll again address later, then that would set up a transitive trust all the way through all the child domains both directions, if I so choose. In this case, I'm going to also choose a two-way direction for this trust. This means that it's going to be inbound and incoming and outgoing. We also used to call that a trusting and a trusted domain. That used to be kind of an old Windows 2000 and Windows NT 4 method for describing that. Microsoft seems to prefer nowadays using the terms incoming and outgoing. And by the way, when it says this domain, you know, so on and so forth, this domain refers to whatever the name of the domain is that I typed in at the beginning of this wizard, which happened to be accusource.net. I'm currently on nuggetlab.com, and so when it says this domain, you would think that that means nuggetlab.com. They probably should have worded this dialog better because it's a little bit confusing that way, and it's easy to get mixed around. But again, this domain, that verbiage right there, refers to the domain I typed in, which was nuggetlab.com. And I'm just going to go ahead and set this up as a two-way, by the way. And so then we'll go ahead and click on Next, and we'll say that we're going to set up the sides of the trust. We can do this domain only. If I only have knowledge and credentials of my own domain, that's where I would have to stay. But perhaps I've communicated with the administrators over here in AccuSource and said, hey, we're trying to set up a trust that we already agreed on, and we probably had a bunch of meetings and stuff to discuss this whole thing. So what I need to do now is to enter in some credentials that will allow me to generate the other side of the trust. You see, initially I can only do what I have credentials for in my own domain. I would need credentials for your domain over here to be able to complete the rest of this. So if I had gotten permission from them and they'd created probably a temporary account for me to be able to use, then I would be able to create both sides of the trust, and then I would enter in the username over in AccuSource.local. And I happen to have a trainer account over there as well, so I'll just go ahead and press next here. And now we've been able to create both sides of the trust in this part of the wizard. And then this part's actually pretty cool. Normally you're going to choose probably domain-wide authentication so that we'll be able to exchange any kind of resources back and forth through all of the computers that are members of both of these domains. There's not really any restrictions in any way between that. However, it could be that maybe I only want to have a certain group of users right here. Maybe this is a group of users that I want to be able to access one server right here that has maybe a single file share on it. That's the limit of what I want them to be able to access. If that were the case, then I would want to set something up called selective authentication. And then once I had next and finished my way through this wizard, then I would have to go to the computer properties of that particular computer, and I'm just going to find a computer account to work with here. And then I would have to look for the security tab, which we don't really see right here. And why is that? Well, we'd have to go to View and Advanced Features, and then once we had done that, we could then go to the Advanced tab, or the Security tab. And then what we would have to do is to set up, just add a user or group in here as necessary. And then we would have to choose here the Allow permission that says Allowed to Authenticate. And then only that computer that I set up that permission on would be able to allow resource access to that particular share or whatever it is. But again, that's not necessary unless I choose selective authentication. In my case, I'm going to stay with domain authentication, domain-wide, and then I'll go ahead and click on Next. And then when I clicked on Next here, it almost looks like a mistake or something was wrong with the dialog box. I click on Next and nothing seemed to happen, right? No, actually something did. If you look very carefully, let me go back a dialog box. You might have seen some minor changes there. Look what we were doing here. We were creating domain-wide authentication for the local domain here, okay? Meaning that all the people in AccuSource.local can access resources here in my local domain. And when I clicked on Next, what happened? Look carefully up there at the top. Specified domain. Now what I'm specifying is whether users in the local domain can be authenticated to use all of the resources in the specified domain. In other words, in AccuSource.local. And this would relate to whether or not in AccuSource they had decided to allow resource access to only a specific server and so forth. So it's just two sides of the same coin. I have to decide whether we want domain-wide authentication in my own domain, and then for the other domain we have to decide whether we want domain-wide authentication over there or selective, which I already described. And then we click on Next. That's pretty much it. We get a summary of things that are taking place there. And as we click on Next, we see that the trust creation is complete and successfully created. Okay. Now, if we click on Next here, one more thing you can do, and I kind of like to do this, there's not really a whole lot of reason not to, is we can confirm the outgoing trust. And what it will do is it will exchange authentication information back and forth between the local domain here of nugalad.com and AccuSource.local. And when I click on Next, it will ask me if I want to also confirm the incoming trust. So again, since I created both sides of the trust, it's asking if I want to do both sides there, and we see that the relationship was successfully created and confirmed. Now here I see a dialog box that I want to briefly address. It's a little bit of a complex issue, but it really relates to a pretty simple thing that we want to address. And let me go ahead and address this with my diagram back here. Okay, let's take a look at another situation. And I'm going to do is to clear this up. So I'm going to go to revert so I don't get rid of all my chicken scratch on here. And let's just address this side of things over here. Let's say that I've got some user accounts and some groups, and I've got some computer accounts over here. And we're in losangeles.accusource.local. Well, we decide that we want to move everything into our headquarters office here in Phoenix at AccuSource.local. So we want all these users and groups and computers to no longer have their own domain. We want to move the whole works up here into AccuSource.local. Now that normally works very well. There's some domain migration tools that you can use either from Microsoft, which we'll address later in this series, or you can use third-party products. They both work very well. The thing is, this does not normally happen overnight. So what I want to do is to move those up here, but I've still got maybe, a file server down here with a share on it that these users and groups were accessing daily. Now when I move their user accounts up here, what happens is it generates a new SID for them. Now that they have a new SID, their permissions are no longer valid on this server because they have a different SID. So what we have to do is we have to use something called the SID history during a migration phase. So we'll move the accounts up here. Yeah, they'll get a new SID, but they will also retain their old SID that they used to have down here in an attribute of Active Directory called the SID history. So now they'll actually have two SIDs. One SID to work with this domain here, the other SID, their SID history, to be able to still be authenticated against file servers or whatever else it is that they have down here, Exchange servers, whatever else they need. And then once I've completely also migrated my servers up here, then I can just completely decommission this thing, and then I can kill the SID history attribute. Now, why is it that we want to do something called SID filtering? I don't think that's very well worded, by the way. I think it should say disable SID history, because that's what that would really be. You see, what happens here is during this transitional phase, when these accounts have moved up here and they now have a SID history, a dishonest administrator, perhaps from down here, could be able to manipulate that Active Directory object for a conventional user account up here that has their new SID, and they also have a SID history SID. Okay? Well, they can surreptitiously replace this SID history with somebody else's SID. For example, an enterprise admin's SID from up here. Maybe the administrator down here is upset that he got demoted or something once he came up here. So now he could put a enterprise admin's SID in his own SID history and then manipulate the entire forest to his own liking. Well, that has obvious security implications. By the way, you do have to have administrative access to be able to manipulate that SID history, but it is there and it is something of a concern. Well, what happens by default is that when you set up these trust relationships, SID filtering is going to be enabled, which is another way of saying it turns off the SID history, which makes this scenario impossible because we do not allow a SID history now, so therefore nobody can manipulate that particular attribute. That's what that's all talking about. So now we've got our trust relationships created, and we see that it is an external trust type. Now also, let's go to the properties of a trust right here, and if we do that, we'll see that we can also allow the support for Kerberos Advanced Encryption Standard Encryption, which is the highest level of secured encryption that we can support between these two domains. You probably should enable this if both domains are at the Windows Server 2008 domain functional level. And let's go ahead and take a look at the authentication tab as long as we're here as well. These are the same options that we saw in the wizard. If you just change your mind and you realize this was too broad, you could go down to selective authentication or vice versa as it suits your needs. If you're having troubles with the trust relationship, you want to troubleshoot it, you can also validate once again right here, enter in the credentials for the other domain if necessary, and then you can click OK and it should be valid if everything's working just fine. Okay, so that's how we go ahead and create a trust. One thing I do want to also point out here, though, is that you have to be a domain admin or enterprise admin in these domains in order to be able to establish that trust relationship. Now that we've created this trust relationship, let's go ahead and take a look at how we could leverage that. Let's say that I have some files in this temp directory that I want to share. So I right-click and share it, and then I want to add, but I'll choose find in this case because it's not going to list people from either domain actually right now until I click find and then choose which location it is that I'm interested in. Notice that now accusource.local will appear, and I can choose from different OUs within that as well if I want to, but I'm okay with searching against the domain. And maybe I want to look for a user named J. Conrad, for example. Okay, so there's J. Conrad, and that user is now able to access this share according to whatever permission level I assign. I just share it, and that's really all there is to it. Now I'm done, and it's shared to that domain. Okay, so that was again a manual trust because I manually created it. It didn't have inherent trust relationships that were already transitive as a result of being a child domain or something. And it was an external trust. It was created to some other domain that we didn't have a previous relationship with. There's also a realm trust, and this is something that we don't create an awful lot of, but these are designed to work with other Kerberos version 5 implementations. You see, Kerberos is not a Microsoft invention, and there are other, for example, Unix implementations out there of Kerberos on other kinds of servers and other operating systems. And if we wanted to create a trust relationship still using Kerberos with one of those other types, then we could create a realm trust. And then there's also a forest trust. We're going to take a look at that here shortly. In fact, let's go ahead and look at that right now. But let me address what that is. A forest trust is going to say, rather than just trusting an external trust, like I showed you just a moment ago in the demonstrations, I want to trust your entire forest, including all of the child domains. So in this forest trust relationship, we don't have a trust that exists here, and I'm going to go ahead and quickly erase that. So these are just two independent companies that have no relationship whatsoever to one another. And what I want to do is, I want to put the line back in. And I'll do it by more than just drawing on a whiteboard. I want to go ahead and use a wizard to create this forest trust, so that not only do we trust the root of both domains, but we also trust each other's children all the way throughout the hierarchy. Now, one thing I do want to point out with this as well, though, is let's say that prior to creating this trust relationship, maybe AccuSource.local had another business partner that they had also created a trust relationship with. Okay, and they had their own child domains and so forth. So they already have this forest trust relationship here going on. Then they decided to do business with us as well, so we created another forest trust right here. This is non-transitive to this external domain over here, external forest. We still have transitive trusts between the two of us through this relationship right here, but just because I've created this forest trust relationship right here does not mean that I now also automatically trust this domain and this forest over here. If I really wanted to access those resources from NuggetLab.com, I would have to create another forest trust over here. All right, then, so to go ahead and create that trust relationship, I'd simply go back where I was before at the root of one of my forests, and I'd right-click here and choose Properties to go to Trusts, where you'll see that I've already removed the AccuSource.local trust that I created earlier. That was an externally created, manually created trust, because I want to rebuild this instead of as a normal kind of a trust. It wants to be a forest trust. By the way, to remove it, you simply click on it and choose Remove. Not that much to it. So I'll choose a new trust right now and click on Next, and I'll enter in the name of the other forest. Okay, AccuSource.local again. And then this time it's going to be, instead of an external trust like I created last time, it's going to be a forest trust. So that if AccuSource.local has any child domains, we will include them in the trust relationship in a transitive way. Again, I can do two-way or one-way incoming and one-way outgoing. Just depends on whether or not both domains are exchanging accounts that we can use. And again, it's probably going to be a temporary account set up for only purposes of this trust relationship. It'll probably have a very short expiration and all that kind of thing, just to narrow the scope of any security vulnerabilities. And then once again, I can do this for both sides of the specified domain. Otherwise, I could just go run over to AccuSource.local and run the wizard over there as well. I'm going to choose both sides here just to kill two birds with one stone. And I'll again enter in credentials. Local credentials here that can work with that other side of the trust. Then I'm going to go ahead and work here with forest-wide authentication. Okay, again, I could choose selective authentication, very similarly to what I showed you earlier for an externally created trust. But it's forest-wide, and I'm going to click on Next. Again, it's going to be forest-wide on both sides of things, okay, on the local forest as well as the specified forest. Then I'm going to click on Next. And that's pretty much it, except if I want to verify it, which I can do as well. Oh, this is an interesting dialog. Let me point out what this is about. Over on the other side, over on the other forest, which is AccuSource.local, notice here that they have created a user principal name suffix. Okay, and they did that probably to make things easier for users over in that domain. So what I have to do is I can leave this item checked, but I have to have a way of resolving AccuSource.net properly. I'm not going to be able to really do that because AccuSource.net is actually also on the internet, and we don't need to use their UPN suffix. So in order to avoid name resolution problems and complications, I'll clear that and click on Next for that side. On my side of things, I have also got a user principal name suffix that I created here that I think we saw in a previous nugget. So I'm going to clear that one as well because I don't want to cause name resolution problems and conflicts in the other side of the forest. So I'll click on Next, and again I can confirm this, and then Next, and we're pretty well done after that. We can confirm both sides, and that's really all there is to it. Successfully created and confirmed. That's it. Now keep in mind that when we create this type of a forest trust, it's going to require that we have at least Windows Server 2003 forest functional level or later. And the reason for that is because Windows 2000 did not support forest-wide trusts. Also, when you create a trust, by the way, whether it's the externally created one that I did earlier or it's the forest trust that I created just now, what happens here is it's going to add the other domain or domains, in this case, to the authenticated user's security group, which gives them pretty much the equivalent level of access as my existing users in my own domain. Now also, when we create these trust relationships, these all relate to exam objectives that have descriptions like cross-forest authentication, which some other ones you might see there. You'll see authorization and authentication, or intra-organizational authentication and authorization. That sort of thing all relates to some of these items. The last thing we'll talk about here, though, is a shortcut trust. And let's take a look at how that might work. Here, I might have a server, and it's got, let's say, a file share here. We want a user to be able to access it from this domain over here. Wow, it looks like I almost decapitated that user. Their head's like on sideways or something. But anyway, so here we got a user that wants to access this folder. So they sit at their desktop and they double-click on their network drive and they try to open up this folder. Well, then what happens? Well, possibly nothing of note. They might just immediately open it and authentication took place just fine. But a lot of times what will happen, especially if your forest infrastructure is several layers deep, then they may see an hourglass for a long, frustrating period of time, and then it may just eventually time out and they can't access it. So really, why is that's taking so long sometimes? Well, what happens here is, if they don't really see, if this server right here, this file server, doesn't see the domain controller for this user right here, then it will say, I don't know who they are, so I'll forward you up the tree to these people. Well, these people, this domain here doesn't know who they are either, so they forward you up to this one. Well, this domain doesn't know who they are, so they forward you over here, and this domain doesn't know who they are either, so they forward you down here to their actual home, domain of this user account. And that whole process where we go up and then down the hierarchy is known as walking the tree. This can take a long time, especially in deep infrastructure. So what you might want to do is create a shortcut trust where we will trust this domain. Okay, this would be then our outgoing trust, if you will, to this domain, and we'll trust this user. Now, instead of walking the tree, we directly contact this domain over here, and we say, do you know who that user is? Of course we do. They're authenticated. They access the resource. That is a shortcut trust. In this nugget, we talked about the various types of trusts. The first one is the one that you manually create. In other words, it's not a trust that already exists because it's a parent-child relationship, as in a forest relationship. Instead, you can create a manual trust, normally to an external trust, which would be like another company that you want to exchange resources with. That's just an example, but that's what you do when you have two domains that want to exchange resources non-transitively. Also, you can create a realm trust. Remember, this is what we use to establish trust relationships with something like a Unix operating system, so that we can establish a Kerberos version 5 trust relationship there. And then we can also do a forest trust, which allows two forests to have transitive trust relationships with all the constituent domains of each forest. We also talked about a shortcut trust, which allows you to improve performance, especially in deeper forest relationships, so that you can avoid having to walk the tree. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.